The crisp autumn air nipped at my cheeks as I stepped out of our cozy suburban home. The trees lining our street were ablaze with fiery reds and golds, a sight that never failed to take my breath away. Today was special, though. It marked a decade since I'd said I do to Mark, the man who'd swept me off my feet all those years ago. I'd woken up to the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and Mark's boyish grin. "Happy anniversary, Lena," he'd said, placing a steaming mug in my hands. His blue eyes twinkled with excitement, reminding me of the day we first met at a local coffee shop in downtown Boston. It felt like yesterday, yet here we were, 10 years later, still madly in love. "So, what's the plan for today?" I asked, sipping my coffee. We usually celebrated with a fancy dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, Angelo's, where we'd had our first date. Mark's grin widened. "I thought we'd do something different this year. How about a drive through the countryside? I know this beautiful spot by a lake. It's a bit of a hidden gem. We could have a picnic, watch the sunset. What do you say?" The idea sounded perfect. A quiet, intimate celebration, just the two of us surrounded by nature's beauty. I quickly packed a few sandwiches, some fruit, and a bottle of wine while Mark loaded a blanket and some cushions into the car. As we set off, the familiar streets of our neighborhood gave way to winding country roads. The radio played softly in the background, a mix of our favorite songs from the past decade. We sang along, laughing at our off-key attempts at the high notes. Mark reached over and squeezed my hand, his touch warm and comforting. "Remember our road trip to Cape Cod in our first year of marriage?" I asked, feeling nostalgic. Mark chuckled. "How could I forget? We got so lost because I refused to use the GPS. And we ended up at that quirky little bed and breakfast run by the elderly couple who thought we were newlyweds," I added, smiling at the memory. As we reminisced about our past adventures, I noticed the scenery changing. The roads became narrower, less maintained. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns on the road. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, a small knot of unease forming in my stomach. We hadn't passed another car in what felt like hours. Mark nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Trust me, Lena. It's a bit off the beaten path, but it'll be worth it." I tried to relax, focusing on the beauty around us. The forest was alive with the rustle of leaves and the occasional cry of a bird. It was peaceful, yet somehow unsettling in its isolation. As time wore on, I noticed Mark growing quieter. His responses to my attempts at conversation became shorter, more clipped. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his jaw set in a hard line. It was so unlike him. Mark was usually the one to fill silences with jokes or random trivia. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "You're awfully quiet." He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Just concentrating on the road. It gets tricky around here." I nodded, not entirely convinced. Was he stressed about the surprise? Or was there something else on his mind? We'd been going through a rough patch lately, nothing major, just the usual stresses of work and life getting in the way. But we'd always managed to work through our problems before. That's what made us strong, right? The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road. The golden light that filtered through the trees should have been beautiful, but instead, it felt ominous. The knot in my stomach tightened. "Mark," I said, unable to keep the tremor out of my voice, "maybe we should turn back. It's getting late, and I'm not sure." My words were cut off as Mark suddenly accelerated. The car lurched forward, pressing me back into my seat. Trees whizzed by in a blur of green and gold. "Mark," I cried, clutching the seat belt. "What are you doing? Slow down." He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but they seemed distant, almost glazed over. This wasn't the man I knew, the gentle soul who always drove 5 miles under the speed limit just to be safe. Fear, cold and sharp, coursed through me. Something was terribly wrong. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was Mark having some kind of breakdown? Should I try to grab the wheel? Before I could act, Mark did something that turned my blood to ice. Without warning, he unbuckled his seatbelt. The car's warning chime pierced the air, a shrill counterpoint to the blood rushing in my ears. "Mark, what are you doing?" I screamed, reaching out to him. But he was beyond my reach, both physically and emotionally. He turned to me then, and the look in his eyes will haunt me forever. It was a mixture of sorrow, determination, and something else, something cold and calculating that I'd never seen before. "Forgive me," he whispered, the words barely audible over the roar of the engine and the pounding of my heart. Time seemed to slow down. I watched in horror as Mark's hand moved to the door handle. With a sharp yank of the steering wheel, he sent the car careening toward a massive oak tree that loomed ahead of us. Then, in a move that defied belief, he threw open the door and hurled himself out of the moving vehicle. The world spun around me. I screamed, my hands scrabbling uselessly at the dashboard as if I could somehow stop what was happening. The tree filled my vision, growing larger by the second. In those final moments before impact, 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. How had we come to this? What had I missed? Was this really happening, or was it some terrible nightmare that I'd wake up from, safe in Mark's arms? But there was no waking up. The car slammed into the tree with a deafening crash. Metal crumpled, glass shattered, and my body was thrown forward against the restraint of the seatbelt. Pain exploded through me, and then everything went black. In that moment of darkness, suspended between life and death, I clung to a single thought. Why? Why would the man I loved, the man I trusted more than anyone in the world, do this to me? As consciousness slipped away, I knew that if I survived, nothing would ever be the same again. The drive into darkness had changed everything, and I was hurtling into an unknown future, alone and betrayed. The world came back to me in fragments. First, there was pain, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to radiate from every part of my body. Then, sound, a high-pitched ringing in my ears, punctuated by the hiss of escaping steam and the crackle of what I later realized was the beginning of a small fire. Finally, smell, the acrid stench of burning rubber and gasoline that made my stomach churn. I forced my eyes open, blinking against the smoke that was starting to fill the car. The windshield was a spider web of cracks, and beyond it, I could see the mangled hood of our car wrapped around the trunk of the massive oak tree. For a moment, I couldn't remember how I got here. Then it all came rushing back. The drive, Mark's strange behavior, his last words before he... "Mark," I called out, my voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. But there was no response. Of course not. He had jumped out of the car. Left me to die. The reality of what had just happened hit me like a second impact. My husband, the man I had loved and trusted for 10 years, had just tried to kill me. The shock of this realization momentarily overshadowed the pain from my injuries. I needed to get out of here. The smell of gasoline was getting stronger, and I could feel the heat of the growing fire. With trembling hands, I fumbled with my seatbelt. It took 3 attempts before I managed to release it, my fingers feeling thick and uncooperative. Pushing the door open took all my strength. I half fell, half crawled out of the wreckage, dragging myself away from the car. The forest floor was damp and cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the crash site. I made it about 20 feet before collapsing behind a fallen log, my body screaming in protest at the exertion. From my new vantage point, I took stock of my injuries. My head was throbbing, and I could feel blood trickling down the side of my face from a cut near my temple. My left arm was scraped raw from elbow to wrist, and every breath sent a stab of pain through my ribs. But I was alive. Somehow, miraculously, I had survived. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full weight of what had happened started to sink in. Why would Mark do this? What could possibly drive him to such an extreme? We'd had our problems, sure, but nothing that would explain this. Tears welled up in my eyes, a mix of pain, fear, and betrayal. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. The growing chill of the evening air eventually roused me fully. I needed to move, to find help. But where? We were miles from anywhere, on a road that saw little traffic. And who could I trust? If Mark had tried to kill me, who else might be involved? As I struggled to my feet, leaning heavily against a tree for support, a sound caught my attention. Voices. Faint, but unmistakable. and one of them was horribly familiar. Mark. Fear gripped me. Was he coming back to finish the job? I crouched down, ignoring the protest from my battered body, and peered through the underbrush. About 50 yards away, I could make out two figures standing next to a car parked on the side of the road. One was Mark, looking disheveled but largely unharmed. The other I couldn't quite make out in the fading light. I inched closer, staying low and hidden. As I drew nearer, I could start to make out what they were saying. Mark was on the phone, his voice low but clear in the still evening air. "It's done," he was saying. "The car is totaled, and she didn't make it. Everything is ours now. Prepare the documents for the assets." I felt as if I'd been punched in the gut. Assets? What assets? And who was he talking to? "Yes, Mother," Mark continued, and I felt my world tilt even further off its axis. "Thank you for the guidance. We'll celebrate tonight." His mother. Martha. The woman who had welcomed me into her family with open arms, who had treated me like a daughter. They had planned this together. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. As the reality of the situation sank in, a cold fury began to replace the fear and confusion. They had tried to kill me for my money. The inheritance I had received from my parents, the trust fund I had largely forgotten about since marrying Mark. It had never seemed important. We had built our life together, sharing everything. Or so I had thought. I watched as Mark ended the call and got into the car with the other figure, his mother, I now realized. They drove away, leaving me alone in the growing darkness. They thought I was dead. And for now, that was my advantage. I waited until the sound of their car had faded completely before I moved. Every step was agony, but I forced myself to keep going. I needed to get to safety, to figure out my next move. But I couldn't go home. That would be the first place they'd look if they realized I was alive. I couldn't go to the police, either. Not yet. Not without proof. As I stumbled along the road, my mind raced. Who could I trust? Most of our friends were mutual, people we'd met as a couple. For all I knew, they could be in on the plot too. I needed someone from my past, someone who had no connection to Mark or his family. A memory surfaced, Daniel Graves. He was an old family friend, an attorney who had helped manage my inheritance before I married Mark. We had fallen out of touch over the years, but I remembered he had an office in a town not too far from here. If I could just make it there. Hours passed as I made my way slowly down the road. The forest eventually gave way to farmland, and finally, I saw lights in the distance. A gas station, its neon sign a beacon of hope in the darkness. As I approached, a truck pulled into the lot. The driver, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard, stepped out and immediately noticed me. His eyes widened in shock. "Jesus, lady, what happened to you?" he exclaimed, rushing over to help me. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Car accident," I managed to say. "I need to get to town. Please." The man, who introduced himself as Joe, looked uncertain. "You need a hospital, Let me call an ambulance." "No," I said, perhaps too forcefully. Seeing his startled expression, I softened my tone. "Please, I just need to get to town. It's important." Joe studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But at least let me get you cleaned up a bit first." He helped me into the store, where the clerk gasped at my appearance. Joe bought a first aid kit and some water, then carefully cleaned the cut on my head and bandaged my arm. As he worked, I caught sight of myself in a mirror behind the counter. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me, pale, bruised, with wild eyes and blood-matted hair. "Thank you," I said to Joe as he finished. "I don't know how to repay you." He waved off my thanks. "Don't worry about it. Now, let's get you to town." As we climbed into his truck, Joe handed me an old flip phone. "Use this if you need to call someone. It's got some minutes left on it." I clutched the phone like a lifeline. Once we were on the road, I dialed Daniel's number from memory, praying he still used the same one after all these years. To my immense relief, he answered on the third ring. "Daniel Graves speaking." "Daniel," I said, my voice breaking. "It's Lena. Lena Thompson. I need your help." There was a pause, then, Lena? What's wrong? Are you okay? I took a deep breath. No, I'm not. Something terrible has happened. Can I come see you? Tonight? To his credit, Daniel didn't hesitate. Of course. I'm at my office. Do you need me to come get you? No, I've got a ride. I'll be there soon. I ended the call and turned to Joe. Can you take me to the law offices in town? I have a friend there. Joe nodded, concern etched on his weathered face. Sure thing. You in some kind of trouble, miss? I looked out at the dark road ahead, my determination growing with every mile that separated me from the crash site. Yes, I said quietly. But I'm going to fix it. As we drove towards town, towards Daniel and the hope of unraveling this nightmare, I made a silent vow. Mark and Martha thought they had one. They thought I was weak, easily disposed of. But they had underestimated me. I would survive, I would fight back, and I would make sure they paid for what they had done. The game wasn't over, it had only just begun. The neon sign of Graves and Associates flickered dimly in the night as Joe's truck pulled up to the curb. My heart was pounding, a mix of anticipation and fear coursing through my veins. This was it, my first step towards reclaiming my life. You sure you'll be okay? Joe asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I managed a weak smile. I will be. Thank you for everything, Joe. I don't know what I would have done without your help. He nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a crumpled business card. If you need anything else, give me a call. Be safe, you hear? I took the card, touched by his kindness. As I watched his truck disappear into the night, I took a deep breath and turned towards the building. It was time to face whatever came next. The moment I stepped into the office, Daniel's eyes widened in shock. Good Lord, Lena, what happened to you? Before I could answer, my legs gave out. Daniel rushed forward, catching me before I hit the ground. He helped me to a nearby couch, his face etched with worry. I need your help, Daniel, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark tried to kill me. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Daniel's face went through a range of emotions, disbelief, anger, and finally, determination. Start from the beginning, he said, grabbing a notepad. Tell me everything. And so I did. I poured out the whole terrible story, the anniversary drive, Mark's strange behavior, the crash, and the conversation I'd overheard. Daniel listened intently, his pen scratching across the paper as he took notes. When I finished, he sat back, running a hand through his graying hair. This is incredible, Lena. And not in a good way. We need to call the police immediately. I shook my head. No, not yet. We don't have any proof. It'll be my word against theirs, and right now, I'm supposed to be dead. We need to gather evidence first. Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced him. All right, he said. Where do we start? The assets, I replied. Mark mentioned preparing documents for the assets. That must be my inheritance. Can you check if there have been any recent changes or transfers? Daniel nodded, moving to his computer. As he typed, I could feel the adrenaline that had been keeping me going start to fade. The events of the day crashed over me like a wave, and I found myself fighting back tears. Lena, Daniel said softly, noticing my distress. You should rest. We can continue this in the morning. I shook my head stubbornly. No, I can't. Not until I know what we're dealing with. Please, Daniel. I need to understand why they did this. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. All right. But at least let me call my wife. She's a doctor, she can check you over while I dig into this. I agreed, and soon Daniel's wife, Sarah, arrived. She gasped when she saw me but quickly switched into professional mode. As she examined my injuries, Daniel worked at his computer, occasionally making phone calls in hushed tones. It was past midnight when Daniel finally looked up from his screen, his face grim. Lena, I think I've found something. And it's not good. He turned the monitor towards me. On the screen was a series of emails between Mark and his mother, Martha. As I read through them, I felt my blood run cold. The emails detailed their plan, stretching back years. They had targeted me for my inheritance from the very beginning. Mark's courtship, our entire relationship, it had all been a carefully orchestrated scheme to gain control of my assets. There's more, Daniel said, pulling up another document. They've been forging your signature on documents, gradually transferring your assets to accounts under Mark's name. The final transfer was set to occur upon your death. I felt numb. The magnitude of the betrayal was almost too much to comprehend. My entire life for the past decade had been a lie. How? I started, my voice breaking. How did you find all this? Daniel looked a bit sheepish. I may have employed some less than legal methods. I have a friend who's good with computers. He was able to access their email accounts. Under normal circumstances, I might have been shocked at the invasion of privacy. But now, I felt only gratitude. Thank you, Daniel. This is exactly what we needed. As the night wore on, we dug deeper into Mark and Martha's scheme. We uncovered offshore accounts, falsified documents, and a web of lies that made my head spin. With each new discovery, I felt my shock and pain slowly transform into something else, anger, and a fierce determination to see justice done. By dawn, we had compiled a substantial dossier of evidence. Daniel looked at me, his eyes serious. Lena, we have more than enough here to go to the police. We should do it now, before they realize you're alive and try to cover their tracks. I shook my head. Not yet. I want to confront them myself. I need to see their faces when they realize their plan has failed. Daniel frowned. That's dangerous, Lena. They've already tried to kill you once. I know, I said. But I'll have you with me. And we'll be prepared this time. After some discussion, we agreed on a plan. We would confront Mark and Martha at my family's estate, the very place they thought they had stolen from me. Daniel would arrange for a federal investigator to be present, hidden until the right moment. As we finalized the details, I caught sight of myself in a mirror. My face was bruised, my hair matted with dried blood. But my eyes were alive with a fire I hadn't felt in years. I need to clean up, I said. I want them to see me strong, not broken. Sarah, who had been quietly supportive throughout the night, stepped forward. Come with me, she said. We'll get you ready. The next few hours were a flurry of activity. Sarah helped me shower and dress, lending me some of her clothes. Daniel made calls, arranging for the investigator and securing the estate without alerting Mark or Martha. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a golden glow over the city, I stood before the mirror once more. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who had started this journey. She was battered, yes, but not beaten. Her eyes held a steely determination, a strength born from adversity. Are you ready? Daniel asked, appearing in the doorway. I nodded, squaring my shoulders. Let's do this. As we drove towards the estate, I thought about the woman I had been just 24 hours ago. Naive, trusting, blind to the betrayal that had been unfolding right under my nose. That woman was gone now, consumed by the fire of Mark and Martha's treachery. From her ashes, a new Lena had risen, stronger, wiser, and ready to fight for what was rightfully hers. The familiar gates of the estate came into view. This place had once represented happy memories, family gatherings, lazy summer afternoons, the beginning of my life with Mark. Now it stood as a symbol of deceit and betrayal. But I was here to reclaim it, to reclaim my life. As we pulled up to the house, I saw Mark's car in the driveway. My heart raced, a mix of anger and anticipation coursing through me. This was it. The moment of truth. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Remember, we have the upper hand. They don't know we're coming. Are you sure you want to do this? I took a deep breath, centering myself. I'm sure. It's time to end this. With that, I stepped out of the car, ready to face my would-be murderers. The old Lena had died in that car crash. This Lena, the one rising from the ashes of betrayal, was here to take back what was hers and ensure that justice was served. As I walked towards the front door, my steps steady and purposeful, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. Whatever happened next, I was ready. The time for fear and confusion was over. Now, it was time for reckoning. As I stood before the grand oak doors of my family's estate, a strange calm washed over me. This house, once a symbol of love and family, now felt like a battlefield. I took a deep breath, savoring the crisp morning air, and pushed the doors open. The foyer was just as I remembered it, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the marble floor. Family portraits lined the walls, silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. I could hear voices coming from the dining room, Mark and Martha, no doubt celebrating their supposed victory. Daniel squeezed my shoulder reassuringly. "I'll be right behind you," he whispered. "Remember, we have the upper hand." I nodded, straightening my borrowed clothes and squaring my shoulders. It was time. As I walked into the dining room, the scene before me was surreal. Mark and Martha sat at the long mahogany table, crystal champagne flutes in hand, looking for all the world like they were at a casual brunch rather than reveling in attempted murder. "Well, isn't this cozy?" I said, my voice cutting through their laughter. The effect was instantaneous. Mark's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. Martha's face drained of color, her hand flying to her throat in shock. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. "Elena," Mark stuttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How, what?" "Surprised to see me?" I asked, taking a step forward. "I bet you are. It's not every day the dead come back to life, is it?" Martha was the first to recover. "Lena, darling," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "We were so worried. When we heard about the accident save it," I cut her off, my tone icy. "I know everything. The plot, the forged documents, the offshore accounts. Did you really think you'd get away with it?" Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Lena, you're confused. You've been in an accident. You need help. The only ones who need help are you two," Daniel said, stepping into the room. "Preferably legal help." Mark's face contorted with rage. "You have no right to be here. This is a family matter. Family." I laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call people you try to murder for their money?" Martha stood up, her composure cracking. "Now, let's all calm down. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, pulling out my phone. "In fact, why don't we all listen to what there is to understand?" I pressed play, and Mark's voice filled the room. "It's done. The car is totaled, and she didn't make it. Everything is ours now. Prepare the documents for the assets." The color drained from Mark's face as he heard his own words. Martha sank back into her chair, her carefully maintained facade crumbling. "How did you?" Mark began, but I cut him off. "Did you really think I'd die that easily?" I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Did you think I was so weak, so helpless, that I'd just roll over and let you take everything from me?" Mark's shock was quickly replaced by anger. He took a step towards me, his fists clenched. "You don't understand. We had no choice. Your family's money was mine," I finished for him. "Not yours. Never yours. We deserved it." Martha suddenly shrieked, her composure completely gone. "We put up with you for years, played the perfect family. It should have been ours." Her outburst shocked even Mark, who turned to stare at his mother in disbelief. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction seeing their united front crumble. "Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "But your little plan has failed. And now, you're going to face the consequences." As if on cue, two men in suits entered the room. I recognized one as Mr. Allen, the federal investigator Daniel had contacted. The other was unfamiliar, but his stern expression and the badge on his belt made his role clear. "Mark Evans, Martha Evans," Mr. Allen said, his voice authoritative. "We have some questions for you regarding allegations of attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud." Mark lunged forward suddenly, his face contorted with rage. "You bitch," he snarled, reaching for me. "You've ruined everything." But before he could touch me, Daniel stepped between us, effortlessly deflecting Mark's attack. The other officer quickly moved in, restraining Mark as he continued to struggle and shout obscenities. Martha, meanwhile, had collapsed into her chair, all fight gone out of her. She looked old and defeated, a far cry from the elegant, composed woman I had known for years. As the officers read them their rights and began to lead them away, I felt a strange mix of emotions wash over me. Relief, certainly, that justice was being served. But also a deep, aching sadness for what could have been, for the life and love I thought I had. "Lena," Mark called out as he was being led away. His voice was different now, softer, almost pleading. "I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I did love you, in my way." I looked at him, really looked at him, for the last time. The man I had loved, the life we had shared, it had all been a lie. But in that moment, I saw a flicker of the Mark I thought I knew. It didn't change anything, but it made what I had to say next a little easier. "I'm sorry too, Mark," I said quietly. "Sorry that money meant more to you than love. Sorry that you and Martha couldn't see the value in family beyond dollar signs. But mostly, I'm sorry for myself, for being blind to who you really were for so long." As they were led out of the house, I turned to Daniel and the remaining officer. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Daniel smiled gently. "You did all the hard work, Lena. You survived, you fought back. I'm just glad I could help." Mr. Allen nodded in agreement. "You've shown remarkable courage, Mrs. Thompson. We'll need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement, but that can wait until you've had some rest." I nodded gratefully, suddenly feeling the weight of everything that had happened. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion began to set in. Daniel must have noticed, because he gently guided me to a chair. "Sit down, Lena. It's over now. You're safe." As I sank into the familiar comfort of my family's dining chair, I looked around the room. This house, which had been filled with so many happy memories, now felt tainted. But as I sat there, I realized something. This house, like me, could be reclaimed. It could be filled with new memories, new love, new life. "What happens now?" I asked, more to myself than to Daniel or Mr. Allen. "Now," Daniel said, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder, "you rest. You heal. And when you're ready, you start rebuilding your life, on your terms." I nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but I had survived the worst. I had faced betrayal and attempted murder, and I had come out stronger. As the morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room, I felt something shift inside me. The pain and betrayal were still there, but alongside them was a new feeling, strength, resilience, and the power of the unexpected. I had been knocked down, but I had risen. I had been betrayed, but I had found true allies. I had nearly died, but I had been given a second chance at life. And I intended to make the most of it. Looking at Daniel and Mr. Allen, I managed a small but genuine smile. "I think I'm ready for that statement now," I said, standing up. "The sooner we get this done, the sooner I can start my new life." As we walked out of the house together, I paused on the threshold, taking one last look at the home that had seen so much drama. Then, with a deep breath, I stepped out into the sunlight, ready to face whatever came next. The power of the unexpected had saved my life. Now it was time to see where it would take me. The days following the confrontation passed in a blur of police stations, lawyers' offices, and sleepless nights. I found myself recounting the details of Mark and Martha's betrayal over and over again, each retelling like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. The district attorney's office moved quickly, eager to build a solid case against Mark and Martha. I spent hours with investigators, going through financial records, emails, and text messages. It was surreal to see my life with Mark laid out in cold, hard evidence, every loving text, every shared moment, now tainted by the knowledge of his true intentions. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Sarah Reynolds said gently during one of our meetings, "I know this is difficult, but your testimony is crucial. The more details you can provide, the stronger our case will be." I nodded, taking a deep breath. "I understand. What else do you need to know?" As I delved into the minutiae of Mark and Martha's scheme, I found myself examining every moment of our relationship under a new light. The romantic gestures, the thoughtful gifts, had they all been calculated moves in their long con? It was a painful process, but with each revelation, I felt a little stronger, a little more detached from the woman I had been. Daniel was a constant presence throughout this time, offering legal advice and moral support in equal measure. "Remember, Lena," he would say, "you're the victim here, but you're also a survivor. Don't let them take any more from you than they already have." His words became a mantra for me, especially on the difficult days when doubt and self-recrimination threatened to overwhelm me. How could I have been so blind? How did I not see the signs? It was during one of these moments of self-doubt that I received an unexpected visitor at Daniel's office. Joe, the truck driver who had helped me on that fateful night, had heard about the case on the local news and had come to see how I was doing. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," he said, his gruff voice tinged with concern. When I saw the story on the news, I could hardly believe it. His visit was a poignant reminder that there was still kindness in the world, that not everyone had an ulterior motive. It gave me strength to face what was coming next, the trial. The courthouse was an imposing structure of red brick and white columns, a place where justice was supposed to be served. As I walked up the steps, flanked by Daniel and Detective Reynolds, I felt a mix of dread and determination. This was it, the moment of reckoning. The trial itself was a grueling experience. Mark and Martha had hired a team of high-powered lawyers who seemed determined to paint me as an unstable, money-hungry woman who had fabricated the entire story. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mark's lawyer said in his opening statement, "what we have here is a case of a marriage gone sour, nothing more." Mrs. Thompson, upon realizing her husband wanted a divorce, concocted this wild tale of attempted murder to secure her financial future. I felt my blood boil at his words, but Daniel squeezed my hand reassuringly. "Let them talk," he whispered. "We have the truth on our side." And indeed, as the prosecution presented their case, the truth came out in damning detail. Emails outlining the plot, financial records showing the gradual siphoning of my assets, and most damning of all, the recording of Mark's phone call after the crash. When it was my turn to testify, I took the stand with a mixture of fear and resolve. As I recounted the events of that terrible day, I found myself looking directly at Mark and Martha. Mark's face was a mask of feigned innocence, while Martha couldn't seem to meet my eyes. "Mrs. Thompson," the prosecutor asked, "in your own words, can you tell the court why you believe your husband attempted to take your life?" I took a deep breath, my eyes never leaving Mark's face. Because to him, I was worth more dead than alive. Our entire marriage, our entire life together, was nothing but a calculated plan to get their hands on my family's money. Mark's composure finally cracked at my words. He leapt to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful bitch," he shouted. "After everything I did for you." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Order in the court. Mr. Evans, control yourself or you will be removed." As Mark was forced back into his seat by his lawyers, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. In that moment of uncontrolled anger, Mark had shown his true colors to everyone in the courtroom. The trial lasted for 2 grueling weeks. Each day brought new revelations, new betrayals. I learned that Martha had been the mastermind behind the entire scheme, that she had pushed Mark to pursue me from the very beginning. I discovered that they had been slowly poisoning me over the past year, setting the stage for my accidental death. Through it all, I held on to my strength, drawing support from Daniel, from Joe who came to the trial every day, and from the memory of my parents who had left me the inheritance that Mark and Martha had so desperately wanted. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury reached their verdict. As we all stood to hear the decision, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant, Mark Evans, guilty. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. I felt my knees go weak, and Daniel steadied me with a supportive arm. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant, Martha Evans, guilty. Tears of relief streamed down my face as the rest of the verdicts were read out, guilty on all counts for both Mark and Martha. As they were led away in handcuffs, Mark turned to me one last time. "You'll regret this," he spat, his face twisted with hatred. I met his gaze steadily. "The only thing I regret," I replied, my voice calm and clear, "is trusting the wrong people. Goodbye, Mark." As we left the courthouse, a crowd of reporters was waiting. Cameras flashed and questions were shouted, but Daniel expertly guided me through the throng to a waiting car. Once inside, I let out a long, shaky breath. "It's over," I whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Daniel smiled, squeezing my hand. "It is. You did it, Lena. You stood up to them and you won." As we drove away from the courthouse, I felt as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The road ahead was still long. There would be appeals to deal with, assets to reclaim, a life to rebuild. But for the first time since that terrible night, I felt hope. Back at my family's estate, which was now truly mine again, I stood in the foyer, looking at the family portraits on the walls. So much had changed since I had last stood in this spot, confronting Mark and Martha. I was no longer that naive, trusting woman. I was stronger now, wiser, more resilient. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the windows, I made a silent promise to myself and to the memory of my parents. I would not let this experience break me. Instead, I would use it to fuel my recovery, my growth, and my determination to live life on my own terms. The reckoning was over. Mark and Martha would pay for their crimes. And I would rise from the ashes of their betrayal, stronger and more determined than ever. This was not the end of my story, but a new beginning. And this time, I would be the author of my own fate. The morning after the trial concluded, I woke up in my childhood bedroom, sunlight streaming through the curtains. For a moment, I felt disoriented, the events of the past weeks feeling like a distant nightmare. But as I fully awoke, the reality settled in. It wasn't a nightmare, but it was over. I had survived, and now it was time to move forward. I padded downstairs to the kitchen, the hardwood floors cool beneath my feet. The house felt different now, emptier, but also full of possibility. As I made myself a cup of coffee, I realized this was the first morning in years that I was truly on my own, answering to no one but myself. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Meeting at the office at 10. Time to start reclaiming what's yours." I smiled, grateful once again for his unwavering support. After a quick shower and breakfast, I headed to his office, ready to face whatever came next. Daniel's office was a flurry of activity when I arrived. Paralegals rushed back and forth with stacks of papers, and the air was filled with the sound of ringing phones and rapid-fire conversations. "Lena," Daniel greeted me, ushering me into his private office. "How are you holding up?" I took a deep breath. "I'm okay, I think. It still doesn't feel quite real." He nodded understandingly. "That's normal. You've been through a traumatic experience. But you're strong, Lena. You've proven that time and time again." We spent the next few hours going over the process of reclaiming my assets. It was a complex web of paperwork and legal jargon, but Daniel patiently explained each step. "The good news," he said, "is that we caught most of the transfers before they were completed. Your family's estate and the majority of your trust fund are still intact." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "What about the money they did manage to take?" Daniel's expression hardened. "We're going after every penny. It might take some time, but we'll get it back. They're not going to profit from what they did to you." As we worked, I found myself thinking about the future for the first time since this ordeal began. What did I want to do with my life now? The possibilities seemed endless, and for the first time in years, I felt a spark of excitement. "Daniel," I said, interrupting his explanation of offshore account regulations, "I think I want to use some of the money to start a foundation. To help other victims of financial abuse and fraud." He looked up, a smile spreading across his face. "That's a wonderful idea, Lena. We can certainly make that happen." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Between meetings with financial advisors, therapy sessions to process my trauma, and brainstorming sessions for my new foundation, I barely had a moment to breathe. But it felt good to be busy, to be working towards something positive. One afternoon, as I was leaving my therapist's office, I quite literally ran into Joe, the truck driver who had helped me on that fateful night. "Lena," he exclaimed, steadying me. "I was just thinking about you. How are you doing?" We ended up grabbing coffee together, and I found myself opening up to him about my plans for the future. A foundation, Hair, he said, nodding approvingly. That's a real good thing you're doing. Turning something bad into something that'll help others. His words stayed with me, reinforcing my determination to make something positive out of my experience. As the weeks turned into months, I slowly began to rebuild my life. The foundation, which I named Phoenix Rising, in honor of my own journey from the ashes of betrayal, began to take shape. We partnered with local law enforcement and social services to identify and assist victims of financial abuse and fraud. I threw myself into the work, finding healing in helping others who had been through similar experiences. Each story I heard, each person we were able to help, felt like a small victory against the darkness that had nearly consumed me. 1 year to the day after the crash, I stood on the balcony of my family's estate, looking out over the grounds. So much had changed in 12 months. The woman I had been, trusting, naive, dependent, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, more resilient, but also more compassionate. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Turn on the news." I rushed inside, flipping on the television just in time to see a breaking news banner. Appeals denied, Mark and Martha Evans to serve full sentences. A weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying lifted from my shoulders. It was really, truly over. As I stood there, absorbing the news, my doorbell rang. Curious, I went to answer it, finding a delivery man holding a large bouquet of sunflowers, my favorite. "Delivery for Lena Thompson," he said, handing me the flowers and a card. I thanked him and closed the door, setting the flowers on the entryway table and opening the card with trembling fingers. "Lena, I hope this finds you well. I just heard the news about the appeals, and I wanted to reach out. You've been on my mind a lot this past year. I'm continually amazed by your strength and resilience. If you're up for it, I'd love to take you out for coffee sometime. No pressure, just two friends catching up." Joe, I found myself smiling, a warm feeling spreading through my chest. Joe had been a constant support throughout this ordeal, a reminder that there were still good people in the world. I picked up my phone and typed out a reply, "Coffee sounds great. How about tomorrow?" As I hit send, I realized I was looking forward to it, really looking forward to something, for the first time in a long while. That evening, I decided to do something I hadn't done since before the crash. I cooked myself a proper meal, using my mother's old recipes. As I moved around the kitchen, the familiar scents and motions brought back happy memories of family dinners and laughter-filled gatherings. After dinner, I poured myself a glass of wine and returned to the balcony. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. As I sipped my wine, I reflected on the journey of the past year. I had lost so much: my marriage, my trust, my sense of security. But I had gained things too. Strength I never knew I had. True friends who stood by me in my darkest hours. A purpose that gave my life new meaning. "Happy anniversary to me," I murmured softly, raising my glass to the fading light. This wasn't the life I had imagined for myself a year ago. It was harder in many ways, lonelier in others. But it was mine, truly mine, in a way my life with Mark never had been. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, I made a silent vow to myself. I would continue to move forward, one day at a time. I would honor the strength I had found in myself by using it to help others. And I would remain open to the possibility of love and trust, refusing to let Mark and Martha's betrayal close my heart forever. The future stretched out before me, unknown but full of potential. For the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it head-on. Whatever came next, I knew I had the strength to handle it. I took one last look at the darkening sky, stars beginning to twinkle into view. Then I turned and walked back into the house, leaving the balcony door open to let in the cool evening breeze. It was time to start living again, really living, on my own terms. As I settled onto the couch with a book I'd been meaning to read for months, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The road ahead might not be easy, but I was ready for it. After all, I had faced the worst and come out stronger. Whatever the future held, I would face it with the same resilience and determination that had brought me this far. The chapter of my life with Mark was over. But my story was far from finished. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning.